Okay guys, this is Mr. Coumbe, how you doing? So now we've got the ways that we can sample from a population and the best way through convenience and ease within our resources to reducing bias as much as we can from sampling the population. We've also sorted out all our variables. So we've got the sample, that's all good. We've got our operational hypothesis. We've worked out how to manipulate the independent variable and how we measure it, and how we're going to get the dependent variable and how we're going to measure that. We also know all the variables, so we've looked at the variables that we are going to keep the same, the ones that we allow to be random, and then we can have a look at the ones that we may not have considered that could potentially have affected the DV itself. So now we have the sample. So how do we look at how we actually split them into two major groups within the experiment itself? Now groups, we'd say group, but these can be individuals. So when we talk about the control group, this is either the group or individual that we don't actually apply the independent variable to. So so we're just going to look for, because in terms of experimental research, we'll look at this particular hypothesis. The second hypothesis was non-experimental, so we won't talk about that in this one. So students who consume high amounts of caffeine measured in milligrams will have low test scores in a memory task measured by percentage recall. So in this example, the control group then would be the participants that don't actually get any caffeine, or maybe they got a decaffeinated drink. They're going to be the control group because they don't actually receive the manipulated variable, i.e. high amounts of caffeine. Whereas experimental group itself, they're the ones that are exposed to the IV. So in this particular example, they're simply the participant or participants that actually drink caffeinated sports drinks. Now, in a simple experiment, you might have two groups literally. One has non-caffeinated, the other one has caffeinated. Or you can have a control, which could be one or few individuals, and several experimental groups with increasing amounts of, say, caffeine. Let's say they increase by 5 milligrams at a time. That you'll get much better trend in terms of data as opposed to just having two groups. So why is it that we have control groups? Control groups, they're pretty important because they tell us that at least if we're giving some sort of experimental procedure to this group, that it is actually the IV that's causing an effect and not some other random variable that we didn't even think about. So it's to make sure that our experiment's actually valid to that particular population and this particular sample. So the purpose of the non-caffeinated group then would just to make sure that it's actually caffeine that affects the ability to recall of the students, and not some other factor like, or big one like could be intelligence or some neurological impairments. Right, so let's think of another experiment. This is one that's a little bit of fun. So this is Coumbe from Toydaria, and he hasn't. So in the Clone Wars, he didn't. In the beginning of the Clone Wars, he hasn't pledged allegiance to neither the Sith, being the Separatists, or the Republic, being the Jedi. So, however, on his home planet of Toydaria, there are these crystals. They're called Forza Aumenta crystals, which the thing with Forza Aumenta crystals is that if you powder them, they have been thought of to increase the force using ability of force users. So Coumbe, before deciding which side to allegiance with, he knows that whichever side he goes with, he's going to potentially have some souped up force users, but he needs to find out what it actually does first. So what he does, he puts out a message out to the system and says, oh, if there's any available force users in the vicinity, come to Toydaria to test out this material that could potentially enhance your force ability. So he puts out the word and he gets these 12 volunteers, these 12 participants in his experiment. As you can see, the red ones with the red lightsabers, they're all Sith, and the ones in the green or blue lightsabers, they're all Jedis, with Jedi Master Yoda there. And also we have Darth Maul, who decided to turn up. So let's do the experiment. So in terms of trying to allocate this group, so we've got our sample. So remember, if the population here would be all Force users, and this is a particular sample of Force users, then you could already pretty much tell me what kind of sampling method that Counbe actually employed in this case. But in terms of allocating them into the two groups, control versus experimental, there are three ways. So the first one is independent group design, where you literally randomly allocate the participants. There's no everyone has equal chance of being in either experimental or control group. Now, obviously, being easy and quick, there's a huge advantages to this particular method, and you can have enormous samples. However, because it's a random process, you can still introduce a lot of bias, because chance can still introduce a lot of bias in this particular instance. So here we go. So Counbe, he just literally splits them down the middle and says, oh, you half go there and you half go there. And then he gives one half the crystals themselves, and then they become enhanced Force users. And then, being enhanced Force users, then just as a test, so as to measure the actual dependable variable and to operationalize it. So the way he would operationalize it is for them to use their Force power to push these really heavy boulders, and it gets them all to do it all at once. Now the ones that are pulsing, they're the ones that have taken the Force Augmenta, and they could potentially have enhanced abilities, whereas the ones that don't, they don't have the they didn't take it. So we'll see. Let's have a look at the results. So they use the Force, there they go, and they push the boulders down, and we can already pretty much see that looks like clearly the ones that took Force Augmenta, they all, except for maybe this one here, they're all pretty much, oh, and also this one, definitely Master Yoda, he absolutely ripped it. Darth Maul was not too bad. The ones here, so that's Sith, and the worst one was unfortunately this little dude over here, who did take Force Augmenta. All right, but on average, it's probably going to, if you were to make an average in terms of distances that they pushed the heavy boulder, it would be about there. So now the second type is called matched participants. Now this takes a little bit longer. That's why it's a big disadvantage. It tends to cost a fair bit, and you have to pre-test participants. And depending on the kind of research, if it's a longitudinal research, being one that goes for a long time, if any of the participants decide, oh, I don't want to be part of this research anymore, they can pull out. If they pull out because they're in pairs, then you lose 2 points of data, which is very problematic. So you pre-test your sample, and you pair them up into particular characteristics where they have similarities. And then from one of the pair, and then you randomly select one of the pair to be in the experimental group and the other one to be in the control group. So then you get even distribution. That's the big thing. You get even distribution of characteristics between each group being control and or experimental. So in this particular one, so if we did match participants, in this one we match them up with their allegiance. So we got the pairs of Sith and pairs of Jedi together, and then we randomly gave them one of the pair the Force Augmenta crystals, crushed them up, and they took it orally. And as you can see, the ones that are glowing, they're the ones that have the Force Augmenta. And then here they are again. And so the dependent variable, they got them to push these heavy boulders and see how far I went. So if we let them push them away, there we go, there's your data. And this one, so the big advantage of this particular one, you can notice that there's an even amount of Jedi and an even amount of Sith that actually took force aumenta, so 3 and 3 each. So that means so with match participants design, depending on how many characteristics you match people up with, you start to control those extraneous variables. So the extraneous variables start to be reduced because you start to control them much more within your sample itself. Right. And the last one, though, because it's very hard to actually find pairs who are exactly alike. Even with twins, genetically they're going to be identical, but in terms of their environment, they would have been raised slightly different potentially. And a lot of the times twins have their own personality, so it's very hard for you to get to even people who are exactly alike. So with repeated measures design, this way, what you do is that each individual, right, each individual within the sample will be exposed to both experimental and the control conditions. Now, often multiple times. And the one I'm going to show you, they're only going to be exposed once. But often you expose them not just the once, you expose them to also variations of the IV. So the big advantage is because you're doing the same, you're doing the control variable, doing the control conditions and experimental conditions to the same person, that eliminates any variation between the control group and the experimental group with each individual person because it's the same person. So that effectively eliminates any extraneous variables between the two data points. The problem with it, because the more times you do it, you get something called the order effect, which can massively impact the data. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, so let's have a look. So if we were to get our repeated measures design from a beginning part, so let's say we end up getting all these volunteers, and then what we do, in the first round, we get them to, so this is the control conditions, so they haven't taken any force aumenta. So then we say, all right, without force aumenta, push these really heavy boulders, and they go, whoa, they use their force and they push the heavy boulders, and there's your results. And then secondly, we give all of them the force aumenta, and then we find out, right, here's the force aumenta, crush it up, take it orally, and let's see what happens. And then they take it, and we can see clearly there is a bit of a difference in terms of their ability to push these rocks, right? The problem with this is that if you expose the same group or the same people, individuals, to that same procedure lots of times, then a couple of behavioral things will happen. Either they'll start to get tired, they'll get fatigued if you do it lots and lots of times, and they might not put in as much effort into the actual experiment. They might get bored, and same thing again, the effort won't be as genuine as it would be otherwise. Or they might start to be familiar of what happened. So if it's like a memory recall type thing, then they'll start to get familiar with the patterns of the memory recall game, and they'll start to get better because they're getting familiar and getting practice with the actual IV. So because of these, this has what we call a confounding effect, i.e. these behaviors will significantly influence the results at the end. Now, the thing we can use to stop this, or at least control and mitigate this, is called counterbalancing. That's where you get half of the group to be exposed to the IV first, and then the second half in the second, and then swap it up. Right, so if we have a look at this way in terms of what's processed, so if we give the second half the force aumenta and the first half of the guys don't, then this could potentially happen. And then in order for them to find out if there's any differences going the other way, we go the other half. So then now we give the first half the force aumenta while we wait for the other 6 to sort of chill out and the force aumenta to go out of the system. Then we do it again, and then we see clearly that the force aumenta actually has affected it. Now, I'll finish here, and we'll talk about a couple of phenomena that happens within the experiments themselves. Okay, I'm Mr. Coumbe, and this is Research Methods.